Let's start off with the conscious faculties. Scientists have admitted that they're not making any real progress. For example, now there's a worker now called David Chalmers. So he's talking about experience. So he says there's an explanatory gap between the functions of the senses and the actual conscious experience of perception. In other words, you can describe how the eye works, you can describe how the ear works, you can describe how it interacts with the brain, but why that should produce a conscious experience, there's no logical connection there at all. So he says there's an explanatory gap, and he says we need an explanatory bridge to cross that explanatory gap. Then he says, I suggest that the theory of consciousness should take experience as fundamental. We will take experience itself as a fundamental feature of the world alongside mass, charge and space-time. And if we take experience as fundamental, then we can go about the business of constructing a theory of experience. So this means that a modern scientist is coming closer to the Vedic way of seeing things by observing that the scientistic, the objective method just does not deliver the goods, and you can see that it's never going to deliver the goods. There's the gap, and he's filling that gap by saying yes, consciousness is fundamental. Thinking. One scientist, he's summarizing the work to date, and he says, instead of a standard model for the mind, there's a theoretical vacuum, a conceptual void filled only by stale philosophical arguments and creaking computer metaphors. In other words, it doesn't look too good. They're not doing too well at the moment. Now, if we just say they're not doing too well, that's not very convincing. But Sir John Eccles is a Nobel neurophysiologist, he's a brain surgeon, and he's produced a very interesting model how the conscious self interacts with the body through the medium of the brain, which is very close to the Vedic concept that the living entity actually interacts with the body through the medium of prana, the life airs, which are very, very subtle, not like gas, but very, very subtle currents of energy flowing through the body, and that the living entity, the conscious living entity, actually manipulates those and in this way controls the body. So Eccles has actually produced a theory, he's produced a theory with evidence which comes very close to the Vedic model. There's Arthur Young, who invented the Bell helicopter, very enterprising inventor and scientist. So he says, the earlier concept of a universe made up of physical particles interacting according to fixed laws is no longer tenable. It's implicit in modern findings that action, rather than matter, is basic. So he's saying that purposeful activity is actually an elementary aspect of the universe. Modern work on the interaction between the brain and robots has produced some very interesting results. Now they're able to implant a detector in the brain, connect that with a computer, and it means that somebody who's totally paralyzed, a quadriplegic for example, can actually use the computer to, for example, turn lights on and off, turn the television off or on or off, change channel on the television, use a computer to open his email, read the email, reply to the email. They can play computer games, even monkeys. They've taught monkeys, using the same process, implanting the electrode in the brain. They've taught monkeys to use a mechanical arm to feed themselves, or you can have monkeys playing computer games, 3D computer games. They've taught. So, in other words, it's just by using by the intention of the object, by the intention of the subject, they're able to change events in the physical world. And this is obviously very, very similar to what goes on in the brain. In effect, they're building a model of the interaction between the brain and the conscious self. And one commentator said this is telekinesis. Simply by the mind, you're changing what happens in the physical world. Which, of course, is what happens when you move your arm, move your limbs. This is also telekinesis, according to this model. And this is the Vedic understanding. Now, why do we say that there's an insuperable obstacle here? This, again, it requires a little kind of mental adjustment, a bit of a logical... it's a logical hoop. If they're going to explain, just take perception, for example, how seeing takes place. Now, you can examine the eyeball. You can examine different kind of eyes, like a squid's got an eye, a snail's got a kind of an eye, birds have got eyes, eagles have got very good eyes, vultures have got extremely good eyes. You can examine how we see, but you can't examine the fact that we see. You can't see that objectively. You can describe the process by which the conceptual, like the biochemistry and so on, takes place, but the actual fact that we see, the actual faculty for seeing, cannot be seen. So since they can't see it, you can't objectively see what seeing is. You can't objectively say what you're talking about when you talk about seeing. So if you can't say what you're talking about, then you can't have a consistent theory how that happens. This is the point. The scientists have to produce a consistent theory how the fact of seeing takes place, but they can't describe what the fact of seeing is. So then there's no possibility of explaining how physical events can give rise to the fact of seeing, because they don't know what it is. They can't describe it objectively. They can only believe that, well, we think that probably somewhere or other we'll get there sometime. But they can't say where there is. So this is an insuperable obstacle. Whenever you try to get outside of perception, you can't do it. It's not an object. Purposeful activity is not an object. Supposing I'm talking about purposeful activity, but that's also a purposeful activity. I can't get outside it. Mental process. How can the mind get outside the mind? It can't. So they can never get outside their process of perception and thinking and acting to see it, to conceptualize it, and then to express it. They can never get outside it. Is that clear?
Yes.
Clear? So that means that there's no way that they can ever come up with a consistent theory. It's an insuperable obstacle. It's not something they're ever going to be able to get over. And it's not rocket science. A young person of 15 can understand these things if it's explained. But we have been so brainwashed that it's really difficult for us. We've been brainwashed into thinking that we're part of the world outside. And to come back and think about conscious processes is very, very difficult for us. So then where's the question of self-realization? Where's the question of being happy? We think that happiness is out there. It's not. Happiness is here. Satisfaction is here. Love is here. Beauty is here. It's not out there. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, we have to find out what the beholder is. Then we can have beauty and happiness and love in society. Otherwise not. This is the consequence of this. Chalmers is saying that we should take experience as fundamental, and that's the case in the Vedic worldview, because it says that both the object of vision, namely sight, form and colour, it's an irreducible aspect of the universe, and also the faculty for perception, the visual faculty, the hearing faculty. This is also an irreducible aspect of creation. It's an irreducible aspect of the universe. You can't reduce it to anything simpler. So what he's saying is absolutely spot on. Now, next thing is conscious self. With the conscious faculties, they're arranged by something. And we say that I see. I'm seeing. Can you see that? Well, if I look carefully, yes, I can see it. If I listen very carefully, very attentively to what you say, yes. If I concentrate on what I'm doing, yes, I can do it. In other words, the I, conscious self, is responsible for coordinating. Now, there has been a massive prejudice against accepting the existence of the self. And one very famous example is David Hume. before Hume, René Descartes, he put forward his famous theory, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He said, I can doubt everything. I can doubt the reality of the room about me. I can doubt even the reality of my body. But I can't doubt the reality of the doubt. So somebody's doubting. He said, somebody's doubting, that means that I exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Then the empiricists came in, especially David Hume, and he said, no. You think that you're thinking, but where's the you? There's no you. David Hume said, for my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and I never can observe anything but the perception. So he challenged, where's the I? There's no I. But the I is there in what he's saying. He says, when I enter most intimately, when what I call myself, I always stumble. I'm the one who's looking. Well, who's the I that's looking for the self? That is the self. The self is not an object. But as we've defined, as I've just defined the self is the conscious entity that coordinates the faculties, the conscious faculties, like the mind and the perceptive organs. So it's that self which is coordinating and looking for the self outside itself, and that's why it never finds it. Descartes couldn't answer that, and for that reason, this dualistic idea, it crumbled, and it's been out of favour for a long, long time. Now it's coming back. Some like for a notable example, Eccles, for example. He's got this dualistic idea that there's a self, conscious self, and there's a body, two different things. But this Cartesian idea, dualistic idea, it was demolished. They thought that it was demolished. This is a Vedic point of view. In the Bhagavad Gita, Dehinos minyatha dehe kavaram jyovanandira, the conscious entity within the body doesn't change, although the body itself changes from baby to youth to maturity to old age. And other scientists are also saying the same thing. For example, Schrödinger again. He says, so in brief, we don't belong to this material world that science constructs for us. We're not in it. We're outside it. Very interesting observation. He says we're only spectators. The reason why we believe that we're in it, that we belong to the picture, is that our bodies are in the picture. Our bodies belong to it. So he's making a clear distinction between the conscious self within the body and the body itself, which is part of the material world, which is subject to the laws of change and the physical laws and so on.
So he's actually defining the psychosis that arises when you negate the self and you're just creating a view of reality where only the body is involved but the self is not involved.
Yeah. Yes, he's commenting very clearly on that. He says he's saying to the scientists, you've taken yourself out of the picture, so don't try and explain how you belong to the picture, because your whole process is to get out of it. Yes, the scientific process, scientists, they withdraw themselves from the world, and then they become completely absorbed in principles which have got nothing to do with direct experience. That is a kind of psychosis. It's an induced psychosis, not a healthy state of mind at all. There's so much practical evidence also. For example, many people have had near-death experiences. There was an investigation reported in the Lancet, which is a very reputable journal of medicine. So it said that 12% of, over a period of 13 years, I think it was, 12% of people who were revived after heart attacks had a near-death experience. They'd been able to, even though the body was dead, the brain was dead, there was no physical cause for consciousness, perception, anything. They could see from outside what was happening in the operating theatre. One of them, for example, he went outside the operating theatre and he went up outside, on the outside of the hospital, up to the 5th or 6th floor, and then he looked in through the window and saw something on top of the cupboard. And then he went back down again. When he woke up, he told the surgeon what he'd seen. And the surgeon went and checked. And he said there's no way that anyone could see it, even from inside the room. You could only see it from outside the room. Some of the patients who were revived, who saw what was happening in the operating theatre, were actually blind. But yet, when they were clinically dead, they were able to perceive what was happening. So this is a clear evidence that the conscious self, okay, there's a strong connection with the body, but the conscious self is not totally dependent on the body. It's not just a product of physical things that are going on in the brain and the nervous system. There's so much evidence for reincarnation as well. For example, under hypnotherapy, there was one hypnotherapist in Australia who put people under hypnosis. Now, for example, there was one subject, she remembered being in Somerset in England. She'd never been outside of Australia. She was talking in a Somerset accent, and she was describing places that were not present on modern maps. It was only when they looked at old maps that they found the place names that she was talking about. And she found the names of the family. They were there in the parish registers. They brought her to the place. She recognized the place. She described already. And she found the house. And she'd already described a pattern on a stone, which was now like 1 foot or 2 feet buried in chicken droppings. And when they cleared away the chicken droppings, there was the stone and there was the pattern on the stone. Now, it makes sense to think that that's actually evidence for reincarnation. I mean, there are other ways of explaining it. That's the most kind of economical way of explaining it. There's just one example. So the conclusion here is that these are some examples that clearly show that when the material scientists try to explain the essential aspects of their own method objectively, as we predicted, on the one hand, the evidence, they can't give good evidence for their belief. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the evidence suggests quite the opposite. It suggests actually the evidence is in harmony with the Vedic point of view, and at the same time they come across these insuperable logical difficulties in putting forward their point of view.